Forest Gump was the first project I worked on with Bob Zemeckis. Bob asked me to work on it because he wanted a sound supervisor who was going to be really hands-on. And there are lots of different ways to do projects. Some supervisors are administrators, and some get their hands dirty, and that's my approach. I go out and make lots of recordings and do lots of experimenting myself, and it turns out that that's what he was looking for Gump.
The good thing about Vietnam is there was always some place to go.
Fire in the hole! Gump, check out that hole.
The Vietnam battle sequence in Gump was a dream for me to work on for several reasons. First, because of the way Bob decided to shoot and stage the scene. As you look at that scene and that sequence, you notice that it's shot in an unconventional way. Instead of beginning with a fairly wide establishing shot so you see the large area where this battle is about to take place or is taking place, you begin very close to the soldiers. And as the battle begins, you get even closer to them. And in fact, the camera is down on the ground with the American soldiers. That swung the door wide open for me, because what it meant was the audience has the same point of view as the American soldiers do. You don't see the enemy that's firing at them. You see exactly what they see, and you hear exactly what they hear. And so that gave me the latitude to put in the sounds of bullets flying over their heads, which we wouldn't have been able to do if the scene had been shot more conventionally with typical wide shots, medium shots, etc., because there's no way in most of those shots we would have been in a place where we could have heard those bullets whizzing over our heads. There's no what we call production sound in the Vietnam battle sequence in Forest Gump. Production sound is the sound that's recorded on the set while the cameras are rolling. And so in a sequence like that, it's pretty typical to have to replace all of the sound in post-production, and that's exactly what we did with the battle scene. And since you're going to replace it, it's going to be ideal to have control over each category of sound, so that when we finally mix all of those sounds together, if Bob Zemeckis says, well, at this point, really all I want to hear are the machine guns that are firing at the American soldiers, or at this point, all I want to hear is the sound of that soldier hitting the dirt, and we don't really want to hear any guns at that moment, or people screaming, etc., then you're able to do that. And so you come to what we call the final mix with a set of pre-mixed categories of sound. And in that battle sequence, we have dialogue, which is one pre-mix. And all of the dialogue in the battle sequence in Vietnam is what we call ADR, automated dialogue replacement. It's the actors coming in after the film has been shot and redoing their lines. In this case, because the technical quality of the recordings that were made on the set wasn't acceptable for us. We have what's called Foley, which is essentially human movement sounds. That is the sound of the soldiers' feet on the jungle floor, the sound of their gear rattling and squeaking as they carry it and as they hit the dirt, etc. The sounds of their guns, handling the guns, that is, not the guns firing, that's a whole other category. But all of the handling of the guns, the cocking of the guns, etc., is handled by Foley. And finally, it's completely convincing that you're hearing somebody move and handle this gun, and you believe that it's the actor. In addition to dialogue and Foley, we have several categories of sound effects. In this battle scene, most of them revolve around guns, mortars, explosions, bullets. The tracers, which are the visual images of the bullets flying by people's heads, were quite a project, partly because those visual images were created by ILM. They were a visual special effect. When I saw what they looked like, it was clear to me what I needed to do. We went out and took various calibers of rifles and fired them at the ground at oblique angles, and I knew from experience that that would give us good ricochet sounds. And one kind of ricochet that you get if you fire a bullet at a hard object and it bounces, it causes the bullet to tumble end over end sometimes. And as it tumbles end over end, it makes a kind of whistling sound. But sometimes it doesn't really make a whistling sound, it just makes a kind of whirring sound just as it goes through the air. And as soon as I saw the visual effects that ILM had done for the tracers, I thought I can take pieces of that kind of ricochet and make that work for the sound of this bullet flying by people's heads. So, in fact, the sound of the tracers is not really a tracer. It's a bullet ricocheting off of something, but it's what worked best. In fact, the mortar sounds in the battle sequence are a combination of various kinds of sounds. Some of those sounds are actual mortars. Some are other kinds of bombs. We also blew up cans of gasoline. Very often when you're doing the sound for a film, you find that the actual thing that's on camera doesn't make the kind of sound that you need it to make. Because when you start doing sound design for movies, you quickly learn that it's the emotional or dramatic content of a sound that's the most important thing, not always the authentic, literal object that you're filming. And so you have to sort of divorce yourself from the literal in a way and just listen to sounds in kind of an unbiased way and think, how does that sound make me feel? And so though we certainly had lots of recordings in our library already of mortars landing, we decided that they just weren't powerful enough or evocative enough, and so we sweetened those with lots of other sounds that more or less relate to things exploding, blowing up, fire, etc., but many of them had nothing to do with mortars, and quite a few of them we recorded at Skywalker Ranch. I was not in Vietnam. I know quite a few people who were, and I can only imagine the emotional intensity of being in a battle, and so that's the area of my imagination that I called on when I was trying to orchestrate all of these sounds to make it seem as horrific as it is. Ironically, Steve Starkey, the producer of the movie, and I more or less met by playing ping pong at Lucasfilm. And so it was funny when he asked me to work on this film that had so much ping pong in it. All of the ping pong sounds that you hear in the movie were done in post-production. None of the sounds that were recorded when the camera was rolling were usable. And so one of the fun things that we got to do, Steve and I and others, was to record ping pongs, and we used various kinds of paddles. We hit the ball off various kinds of surfaces. As usual, we're going for what the best sound is, not necessarily literally what you're seeing on the screen. And every one of those ping pong ball hits was recorded separately, believe it or not. And editors worked through the night to cut each one of those hits in sync, and it was a huge job. The sound of the people in the stadiums for the football games in Gump were a big project for us, too. We knew that we'd need to go out and make lots of little expeditions to record crowds, and so we went to football games, college football games, professional football games, etc., did lots of recordings, and most importantly, recorded the the crowds, the football crowds, from lots of perspectives. We knew that we would need some recordings that sounded like you're hearing 50,000 people yelling at the same time. And so we couldn't stand right next to a few people because they're the main ones that we would hear. So we had to position microphones way up on the light stands at the top of the stadium so that the audience would sound like one giant mass with no individual people standing out. We also needed very close-up responses from people because there are shots, obviously, where we look like we're 5 or 6 feet from individuals. And so we recorded those both in stadium situations and as another part of the replacing of the dialogue, the ADR that we did. The rain in the film is a combination of manufactured rain that we created and actual rain. Forest says that it rained all the time in Vietnam, and in fact there's a sequence where you see it raining harder and harder and harder. And that rain was particularly difficult to do because it started pretty hard, and so by the time it got to the third or fourth moment when it was supposed to be even harder than that, we were afraid that it was just going to be a sort of wall of noise. And so we had to manufacture that rain in a way that would make it articulate and wet sounding. One of the problems of dealing with water of any kind, like surf or heavy rain, is that it tends to just turn into noise or a kind of roar that you can't even tell is water anymore. And so the rain that we made for the film then had to be a combination of actual rain, pretty dense rain, falling on leaves and falling on other water, pools of water, and recordings that we made in bathtubs and sinks or in studios, where you can get a microphone very close to the water actually impacting on whatever it's falling on without getting the microphone soaking wet from the rain falling on it. And then if you combine those really close-up, very articulate recordings of water splashing, falling, with the actual outdoor rain, you get something that you can control and make sound just as wet as you want it to sound. There's a scene in Gump where Forrest is running from a group of young neighborhood bullies, and Forrest has braces on. He's not very good at running. And like in a nightmare, there's no way that he can run fast enough to get away from these bullies who are on their bicycles. And so just like in a nightmare, things begin to slow down for him. And though he tries to run faster, he actually feels like he's running slower. And so Bob Zemeckis decided to slow down the visual imagery there, to go into slow motion. And so we see the bicycle wheels of the bullies that are chasing him going slower, and that is a great opportunity for sound, because anytime that you're in that kind of subjective point of view space emotionally and dramatically, it gives us, the sound people, a lot of latitude to play with the sound and to really use the sound the way you would use music. And so we can then slow down the wheels turning of the bicycle, but not only slow them down, we can focus on very specific sounds related to the bicycle in a way that wouldn't have made any sense if we were looking at the bicycles going at normal speed. So we put playing cards on so that they would drag across the spokes of a bicycle, and recorded that in slower and slower motion. We made very, very close-up recordings of the chain on the bicycles so that we could focus on that sound if we wanted to, and that's exactly what we do in that sequence. You hear a kind of microscopic version, in a way, of these bicycles that are chasing Forest, and the same thing is done with the sound of his braces as he's running, and especially as the braces begin to fall apart and fly all over the place.